29th, 2013, and we are here with Dolores Heaton in Florida. This is Alexandra Levy with the Atomic Heritage Foundation. My first question is to please say your name and to spell it.
Dolores Heaton, Dolores Heaton.
Can you tell us a little bit about where and when you were born?
Well, my birthday is November the 19th, 1933, and I was born in a very small town in Texas called Currens. It's a very rural area, and I was born in a house, a farmhouse. My mother had a doctor, but none of the privileges or things that one would hope that you can have when you deliver a baby, but that's where I was born. Grew up on a farm with my grandparents, and this was in the height, actually kind of the end of the Depression, and my father was always away working when he could find work, and my grandparents were farmers, and we always had a lot to eat, and I was always around a lot of animals, and I had a great childhood in this environment. We didn't know we didn't have a lot because children don't require that. They don't think like that, and so that was my beginning.
Did anything change once the World War II broke out?
Absolutely. All of the men in my family were off in the war, and 2 did not return. And I had 2 uncles that were under General Patton, and they both came back very wounded and were traumatized by the war. But yes, after World War II, things began. During World War II, things began to get a lot better. People were flourishing, and there were jobs. And so my parents, my father was working in different facilities, doing whatever he could do to make a living. And my mother and I then would go with him. We traveled extensively throughout the United States. My father was traveling a great deal in his line of work in engineering, and we have lived all across the United States, from California all the way to upstate New York. So yes, during the war, things did begin to change, and the economy, of course, was booming. He was working for the Navy Department. And we were in Vallejo, California. My father was at Mare Island. And this is where he got information about Los Alamos, New Mexico. And I was probably around, maybe 9 or 10 years old during that time. And he obviously applied for a position in Los Alamos, and in the early 40s, I would probably guess around 44, maybe 43 or 44, he went to Los Alamos. My mother and I went back to East Texas, and she did not know, and this was understood, she did not know where he was going, where he was working. So all of the letters that she would write to my father were sent APO Los Angeles. When she would get a letter from my father, their return address would be APO Los Angeles. So it was so secretive during those days that not even spouses knew where the people were that were going to Los Alamos to work. I was probably around, let's see, the only way I can get my dates very, very sure is that my sister was born in 1944, and she was like 18 months old, not quite 2 years old when we moved to Los Alamos. So that would be 45, latter part of 1945 when we moved up there. We took a train to get to Albuquerque, and then we had to ride a bus from Albuquerque to Santa Fe. When we got to Santa Fe, we had to go to this office. There was a woman there that introduced herself to my mother and took all of our information. My mother had all of our birth certificates, all of our documents. And she gave us temporary badges. I got one also. My little sister didn't get one, but I got one. And that was our identification to get into Los Alamos. We rode a bus up to the hill, which is what they always called it. It was the most horrifying experience, and that is why I remember it so vividly. It's not the nice paved road that you have today. It was a gravel, dirt road, and you could look out the side of the bus, this army bus, and just see nothing but a drop-off. And on the other side was a mountain, and it was just one car area. If a car was coming down and you were going up, the car that was going up always got the right of way. And so these people would have to back up, and so the other automobile could proceed and go on up to Los Alamos. It was horrifying. So we got to the gate, and everyone had to get out of the bus. There were other people on the bus, not that many that I recall. They took out all of our luggage, no cameras, nothing like that. No cameras, absolutely no cameras. They went through every piece of luggage that we had, and we showed them our little ID and proceeded into Los Alamos. And we lived in Quonset huts, very sparse. The army or the military had put military beds and military furniture inside these Quonset huts. Very sparse, everything very green. And apparently, it was fully equipped with dishes and linens and towels, because when you moved to Los Alamos, you didn't take a van of belongings with you. You took what you could take in your bags and your luggage, because it's just the way it was. So everything inside the Quonset hut was very, very sparse. Nothing fancy, no drapes on the windows, no carpeting on the floor. And when we went for our showers, the bathrooms were called latrines, and they were outside. And the army had built, or the military had built wooden walkways out of the Quonset hut to get to the latrine. And let me tell you, when it's December in those mountains, and you're waking up to go out to the bathroom, it's cold. So this is the way we lived for, I don't know how long. I can't gauge the time how long we spent in this Quonset hut. My mother had a chronic back condition, and the military were building a few homes, not big, but they did have 1 or 2 bedrooms in these small houses. My mother, with her back condition, the doctor had said she's got to have a tub to soak her back. So they made a bathroom big enough for my mother to have a bathtub, and that was the only reason we got a house, because homes during those days in Los Alamos were very sparse. They didn't have very many homes. And then the people who occupied the homes were the physicists and the scientists who were working up there. So it was nice to get out of this Quonset hut and the mud and the inconvenience, I guess, of living in this small area and get into a real house that had actually had rooms and doors and places you could get off to yourself, be by yourself for a while. As a child, growing up, my sister was like a year and a half, 2 years old, and I was 10 years older. I was like 11, 12 years old. We used to have all the freedom, no bars held. We could leave home in the morning with a sack lunch, maybe a peanut butter sandwich and an apple or something, and we could go hiking all day. Los Alamos had no crime. They did not have a cemetery. So, because nobody was from Los Alamos, when you passed away, you were sent back to your home. So there was no cemeteries, there was no crime, there was no kidnapping. It was ideal, an ideal situation to have children, to be able to have this kind of freedom, to grow up in this environment. We would take off on this mesa to go hiking or wherever we wanted to go. And there would be a man that would come out of a house. We didn't know who he was. We knew he probably had to be someone pretty special because he lived in a big house, a regular house. And he had some dogs, and he would say, like, you know, where are you going? Or there was very little talking going on. Where are you going? Or what? We'd say hiking. He'd say, can I come along? Sure. So he would come along with us, and we would get on this mesa. We found an old farmhouse up there that was dilapidated and torn down. I don't know who lived there. I don't know who occupied it. But that was kind of our destination, where we would go with our little sack lunch. And then we would sit down, me and my friends, and this gentleman that had come along with us. And he didn't have anything to eat, so I would break my peanut butter and jelly in two, and I would say, have some of my sandwich. Sometimes he'd take it, sometimes he wouldn't, sometimes one of my other friends would give him something to eat. And that was the way it was. This happened more times than not, going hiking with this individual. And I didn't realize who this was until I was probably in high school later on, that this man was Robert Oppenheimer. And he had his little hat on, he had his pipe. He used to sit down on a rock with us and fill up his pipe and smoke it. And there was really not a lot of conversation at all. We'd go down to the creek. I can remember going to a creek and dipping in and getting water, you know, with our hands, or we'd just lean down and drink water from this clear, beautiful creek that they had. And he has accompanied me several times going down to wash his face or to get a drink of water because the water was so clear and so beautiful. So that was my experience with Robert Oppenheimer. We would, the military, whatever the military had, we were allowed to participate in any activities that they had. They had a bowling place where they went bowling, but we had to set our own pins. So we would take turns, you know, rolling the ball, and there was a very, it wasn't like you got today where the balls automatically come back. Someone would have to be there. There was a roundabout way to get these balls back to you, and then we had to set the pins up on the floor, and then straddle this apparatus so that the pins, when they came up, it didn't hit you in the head. And that was our bowling. There was one facility there that the military had. They would have parties at night. They would have concerts at night. They would have wrestling at night. I've seen all of the big bands, Artie Shaw, Count Basie, many, many times up there. All of these big, big bands would come up there. Sunday morning, that was Saturday night. Sunday morning, first thing Sunday morning, that place was cleaned. The military would clean it out. Mass would start at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then that would clear out, and they would clean all that out, and then we had the Protestants then that would come in and have their church. And then after church was over, they would clean all of that out, and then we would have movies. Probably on Sunday afternoon, we would go to a matinee, and whatever they had showing, that's what we would see. It never cost any money. We never had any money. We just would go. I'd go with my friends. We sat on benches in this movie theater and see whatever movie they had. My mother did shopping at the commissary, and they had a PX where we got little special things. I think they had cigarettes or whatever it was that they were selling in a PX. It was just a normal military environment. The military also built us an ice skating rink. That was on the back area going out of Los Alamos, near the tech area, one of the tech areas. And it was just I don't know if they built the little water or if it was just a man-made little tiny lake there. But in any case, to be able to skate, we'd go and we'd have to clean it out. We'd have to clean the ice, and there were great big shovels that we would use to push to clean off the snow so we could go ice skating. It was a little far from the main neighborhoods where we lived, but in order to get there, an Army pickup truck would pick us up. And we would all climb in the back of this pickup truck, and they would take us to the ice rink, and we would skate. And then when we got ready to go home, one of us or two of us, we'd just go back out on the road, and a pickup truck would be coming by, a military pickup truck, and they'd stop. And we would get in the back of this pickup truck, and they'd take us back up to the community. So that's the way we lived. That was free, enjoyable. It was fun. We would stay out till 2 o'clock in the morning if we wanted to, going to other people's homes. We had a youth center there that they made for us. Questions were never asked. We were given, you have to be home by midnight kind of a thing, but there was no worry. I got my driver's license when I was 16 up there, because they had special driving privileges up there for young people. Now I think it's 18 or something like that. And we had, when I first moved up there in the 6th grade, this was before they had a school. And I can't remember how many children, there weren't that many children of all ages and all grades, but we only had one room to go to school. And we had 4 or 5 teachers, but we only had one room. And this didn't last very long, because as I recall, they built a high school, and I think in 44 or 45. And so then all of the grades from first through senior high school went in this one building, but at least we had a room. And I think in the 6th grade, we had some 5th graders that were in there, and they'd kind of, the 5th graders over here and the 6th graders over there, because there weren't that many kids at that time. And then it started getting progressively more and more and more children were coming up there. And so they had to build bigger schools and, of course, better facilities for us. But at noontime, when we were in this one room, like I said, it was enough to fill up the back of a pickup truck. And they would take us to the mess hall for lunch. And so we would climb in the back of this pickup truck and we would go. There were no military people in the mess hall because they had eaten, or we were going the time-wise, I don't know about that. But we had one little corner way up by the food, and we would take our little trays. Oh, I remember the trays were, the place where you scooted your trays, I was shorter than that, and they were so sweet. Can't ever remember anyone up there. All of the military, everybody involved were so kind and so sweet and so accommodating to the children. We had an almost idealistic upbringing. We had all of the privileges. Anything that we wanted, they would come in and build a basketball court wherever they could. This was before we got our new high school. We had no gym. Whatever we needed, the principal, I think it was Mr. Wagner at the time, and I may be wrong at that, I don't remember, probably just sent a request. Gee, it would be nice if my kids had a basketball or tennis courts. I played a lot of tennis during my 8th, 9th grades. We had great tennis courts because they would come in and they would build them if we wanted a tennis court. So there were very few things that we were deprived of. The only thing that was different, because if our parents, not so much me because this was early on, if parents didn't want their children going off of the hill, all they had to do was take their ID card away from them, and they weren't going anywhere. So, because at that time, to get in and out of Los Alamos, you had to have your badge and your ID card, and a badge, it was a piece of plastic, in order to get in and out. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So, anything else?
Can you remember the address of your house in Los Alamos?
Oh, not in the Quonset huts. I don't think they had addresses. We went from the house. I cannot remember the address, but we lived in a Manhattan Loop. On Manhattan Loop at one time, but that was later when we got a real house. I think we had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, and this was much later on. My sister was probably 5 or 6. So you see, that was much later. I was in high school. And then my father went to Eniwetok. They did an atomic testing site there on Eniwetok. And when I was a sophomore in high school, I graduated in 1952, 51, so about in 1949 or 1950, he went to Eniwetok for these tests. And my mother and my sister and I left and went back to East Texas to be with my grandparents. And he was there. I stayed in Texas one school term in my sophomore year. When we went back to Los Alamos, when he got back from Eniwetok, we lived in the western area, the western community, and these were really nice houses. They were very, very, very nice. So as far as addresses, just Manhattan Loop and the western area. That's Trinity Drive. Was it Trinity Drive? Could have been, but I don't remember.
Can you talk a little bit about your father, what his education was like, and if you know what kind of work he did at Los Alamos?
Well, I don't know because everything was so secretive. My father's name was Otis G. Webb, W-E-B-B. And I know on many occasions, he wasn't home. I don't know where he was. He was obviously working somewhere, but I don't know where, and I don't know what. Later on, when we became grown people, we talk about it infrequently. We didn't talk about it a lot. He helped. There was a huge project going on in Los Alamos, and it was the pipeline going up Los Alamos. And I know that he was vital in doing that and trying to get. The city was growing so rapidly. Not the city. Los Alamos has never been a city, but the community was growing so rapidly that they had to improvise, because this had been a school for boys that were ill, and the accommodations up there, they had one huge facility, and I think that was where the boys lived. And Robert Oppenheimer had bought a cabin in and around that area, not the Los Alamos area, but in and around that area. So when they were looking for a place to put the Manhattan Project, he said, I've got just the place. And so that was how they got to Los Alamos. But my father, I don't think that my father was ever inside working in the tech area, so to speak, and maybe he was. This is speculation. I think that because of his kind of work that he did, more in construction work, he was more out doing field work and building the community the way it is today. So that's what he did.
Great. Could you talk a little bit more about the education and how long were you in Los Alamos for? Did you finish high school there?
Yes. We moved up there when I was in the 6th grade, and I graduated from high school, and it was a new high school. I went back to the high school, I don't know, a few years ago. I go back frequently to that area. I still have dear friends there. And we went into the high school that we graduated from and got a little upset because all along, as you go in, they have classes with years up there. And I think they stopped at they didn't have 1952 or 51, 53, they didn't have those. They had all of the ones prior to that. So we went in the office and introduced ourselves, and I said, I graduated from here in 1952, but there's no class picture, a group picture. And they had one because I've got it at home. And I doubt that it's still there, but anyway, we let them know that we thought that our group picture should be in Los Alamos High School because a lot of my friends were hilltoppers, and I was a cheerleader on my senior year in high school. And so we were very involved. We were very much a hilltopper up there. Green and gold school colors, and it was wonderful. It was very nice.
So you liked the high school a lot?
I loved it. I loved it. Here again, we had the best of everything. We had the best teachers, guidance, not just... It's hard to explain. I'm a mother of 2 boys. I know how their schools were. I know they got a good education, but it was just different when we were in school. We were secluded, yes, but we had our friends, and we had a teacher might be an English teacher, let's say, which I'm talking about one particular teacher that I had, Shirley Faries, and who had moved up there when her daughter was just a baby. And when I was in 6th grade, she was teaching me. When I was in 7th grade, she would go up another grade. Latin, English, she would go up another grade. So I had her just about from the 6th grade from when I graduated from high school in 1952. We maintained our friendship. She moved to Dallas, Texas with her daughter, but she still has a home. They still have her house in Los Alamos. And we maintained a very, very close relationship. Now, this is from the time I was in the 6th grade until she passed away maybe 5-6 years ago. And this was my teacher that I had. They took an interest in the person, in the child, in your mental well-being, and not just to teach English or math or science. You were a person. It could be because they had the time. It could be because the classes were smaller. I don't know the reason, but I just know that we were guided. We had mentors, and we were guided. All of the teachers were like mentors, and would help us in any way at all that they could. It was phenomenal. It was very, very, very wonderful.
Were any of your friends children of scientists?
Norris Bradbury, who is one of the big physicists and scientists, they have a Norris Bradbury Museum in Los Alamos. And I went to school with Jimmy Bradbury. We were in the same grade together. Jimmy had another brother. I think he was younger than we were. And here again, the Bradburys, because of their affiliation and because of what Dr. Norris Bradbury was doing, they lived in a regular house while we were in Quonset huts and in smaller homes. But I've been in Norris Bradbury's home many times with Jimmy and my schoolmates, and he was just another man, Mr. and Mrs. Bradbury. Nothing special to us. Always wonderful, always great, always friendly. I don't remember seeing him that often because this would always be during the day when we would go in after school for snacks or whatever, but we always treated very well. So that was, and I think when I went up to Los Alamos, it had to be my last trip up there. They've got two museums. They've got the Norris Bradbury Museum, which is more scientific. It has more of the scientific history. And then they've got another museum there that is shows a Quonset hut. The insides of the hut. Our youth center. And I am pretty sure that I'm in one of those pictures in that youth center. And the man that was working that day, was going out because we were the only ones, except for another couple that was there, that found out that I was from Los Alamos. So I was taking them around this museum, showing them, see this Quonset hut? This is where I used to live. And they were intrigued. They were absolutely intrigued by the fact that they were talking to someone who actually lived in, see that Quonset hut? That was where we lived. This was what we lived in. And then this school picture, and I told this gentleman that was there that day that I really felt like it was my picture, but I don't really think he believed what I was telling him. And I said, well, I grew up here. Then we walked out of the museum and around to look at Robert Oppenheimer's house, which is not very far from this museum where we walked. And it's funny how it looks so small now, but when I was a kid, it looked so big. Of course, a lot of buildings have been built around it as well, and things have changed a lot. But the museum, that particular museum, they really have done a fantastic job of putting all of these little things, together to show people what it was like to live up there during those early days in Los Alamos, and what it was like to be a participant. Well, I didn't do anything, but just be a kid that was taken up there. But to grow up in that arena was unique. I would say very unique.
Did you and your friends have any idea what the purpose of Los Alamos was for, its role in making the bomb?
No, absolutely not. We knew nothing about why we were there. I would ask my mother and father. Got no answers. When you walk through the tech area, which was, the area there was not that big. And of course, we didn't have cars. We walked a lot. We walked everywhere. And we could walk on the sidewalk in front of the tech area. There was one on both sides of the street, these big buildings with these barbed wired fences, barricades that were around these buildings. And like any kid, we were inquisitive. And we would stand and stare at these buildings day in and day out and day in and day out, because that was where we walked. And of course they had guards, MPs were there constantly, checking people's ID as they went in and out of the buildings. But we never questioned, we just knew that there was something going on that we weren't going to be told about. And so I guess we just quit asking. And it became kind of a mysterious, you know how children can build up things in your little brain, and we'd go, well, what are they doing? Dissecting people? You know how children will be flippant about it, and why are they, but we never did know. To answer your question, we never did know what they were doing until much, much later when you grow up and start realizing what was going on up there.
Did you and your friends find it strange that you had to show a badge every time you went back into Los Alamos?
Absolutely. We had our ID card, our badge, and when we would leave, in order to get clothes, you had to leave Los Alamos and go to Santa Fe or Albuquerque. We went to Albuquerque a couple of times a year to buy school clothes. And so every time we would leave, in the early days, you would leave, and by that time we had a car. They would take everything out of the car. They would take your seats out of the car. The trunk was searched, and you were searched, bodily searched. The children were searched in and out. Now that was early. Then they got to be a little bit more lenient. Still no cameras. A little bit more lenient, and I think at one point we were allowed to have cameras, because I've got some pictures that we took of my school friends, that I know we had to have a camera at that point. But the early days, it was very, 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 they were very, very, very strict about going in and out of Los Alamos. You didn't do it. And then going back in, you went through the same process. They would take out all the seats in the car. They wanted to know if you had anything going in to Los Alamos. It wasn't supposed to go in, and that's the way it was.
Do you remember trips to Santa Fe as well?
Absolutely. Santa Fe was really small during those days. It's not like it is today. It's grown, and I hardly recognize it. But Santa Fe was, people in Santa Fe didn't even know what was going on in Los Alamos. They would ask questions. There would be a news article about it every once in a while, the privacy or what's going on up there and on the hill and on the Los Alamos, but they didn't know. Nobody knew. They kept it, and I don't know how they did it. With so many people up there, they kept it so secret that it was miraculous that they could keep it just secret. No planes were allowed to fly over. We used to have blackouts. We would hear a siren, and this was the rule. When you heard this siren going, ran in your house, shut your blinds, turned all the lights out. And these were practices. And we would have to do this periodically. I can't remember doing very many of them, but periodically we would have to have blackouts. And that was early. That was when my sister was just a little baby. So it had to be 45 maybe, early 45, 46 maybe when we were doing that.
Did you have any contact with any Pueblo Indians?
Oh, the Indians? No, not really. In Santa Fe, of course, around, they would always have their wares. I've got a lot of jewelry from that episode. But as far as having contact with them, no, I did not. But during those early days, their jewelry, you could pick up a squash blossom, a big, beautiful squash blossom for probably $10, and now they're probably $5,000, the good ones. So it has definitely changed. But, and Fiesta, they would have big fiestas in Santa Fe, and we would go. So anytime there was something going on, we would leave Los Alamos. My parents would take me, and we would go to Los Alamos to Santa Fe. And I still have friends in Santa Fe that I went to school with. So I would always go and see them. But that was about it. That was about the way we lived. It was, I haven't done this much talking about Los Alamos in ever. I think just not ever. And so I hope I didn't skip around too much. I hope you can I was trying to keep it in context.
Oh, no. This has been great. Do you remember any other activities that your parents liked to do in Los Alamos?
My father was a workaholic, and he worked a lot. And of course, my mother was home taking care of 2 children. But they did participate. We played, because there wasn't a lot to do up there. I mean, really, not a lot. They would get together with friends and play cards. We played a lot of cards. We played a lot of games. There was no television. In the Quonset huts, I don't think we even had a phone when we moved out of the Quonset hut. No phones in the Quonset huts. And no phones in this house that we moved into. I can't remember really even having a phone until later on. There were no telephones. There was an area by the PX that had a pay phone, and I'm not at all sure those phones weren't monitored. I know that the mail going in and out during those early days when my mother was writing my father, they were censored. And especially coming out of Los Alamos. Not that my father ever wrote anything that he shouldn't write, but I'm pretty sure that the mail was censored. That was probably another way that they kept it so secretive for such a long time, which is amazing to me that they could do that. But I'm sure it was censored. Yep.
Did you have any other relatives who worked on the Manhattan Project?
Absolutely. My father was the first. Like I said, he went there in the early 40s. And then when he got there and got established, this was after my mother and my little sister and I went up there. Both sets of my grandparents were there. They didn't stay long because of the altitude. It was very hard on you. Their noses were bleeding, and it was for health reasons. They couldn't stay. Also, I had 3 uncles that worked up there in construction. They were all in construction work that helped build Los Alamos in the way that it is right now, and build the tech areas and build what was inside of those tech areas. So they had access, as my father did, to these areas, but they were constructing. They were building buildings for the military. The military had their own engineers, is a big question. I don't know why the military didn't do all that, but they definitely brought in a lot of civilians that were not in military to do these things. So yeah, I had a lot of relatives, and I had one aunt that was in Tennessee, and working there in the tech area. I don't know what she did. She had something to do with Inuiatak, I think. And she met my uncle, and that's the reason they both came to Los Alamos to work. So she just transferred to Los Alamos. But I am pretty sure, rumor has it in the family that she was very closely associated with the Inuiatak project and did a lot of things in terms of the bomb during those days, yeah.
What was her name?
Her name, what was her name? Well, her married name was Stoker, I can't tell you what her maiden name was.
What was
Julia Stoker was her name, her married name. Married to my uncle. They were all Stokers. Arlen, Alton, and, well, his birth name is, oh my goodness, because we didn't call him by that. I called him Bubba, my uncle. Theophilus was his name. They were all Stokers, S-T-O-K-E-R. And so my grandfather Stoker, and then his 3 sons were all Stokers. And then my grandfather Webb, which was on the other side of the family. But like I said, they didn't stay very long. But no, they were there, and they stayed and bought property in Albuquerque, as we did. You weren't allowed to buy property up there. Even when it got to be more open and more relaxed, you still couldn't buy property until very, very much later. I know I was probably a junior or a senior, maybe a senior in high school, before they allowed people to buy homes. So everyone was leaving. They would work there and maybe rent a small apartment, which is what my parents did. But then they moved to Albuquerque and bought a house because it was time for them to be buying some property, as my uncles did. They did the same thing. And I had another uncle that went to Espanola, around Pewaukee, which is just down from Los Alamos, and bought a home, bought some acreage and bought some land. Because people needed to have something, of their own, and you couldn't establish that kind of security in Los Alamos because they didn't allow you to own property.
And what was your mother's name as well?
My mother's name was Alma Webb. Her maiden name was Stoker, and she worked for a while for Zia, Z-I-A, and I also had my uncle Paul Davis. Paul Davis worked for Zia, and he I don't know what he did as well. I haven't a clue what my uncle Paul did, but they also went to Espanola and bought a home so that they could have some security. And I can't remember any other relatives that were working. That was a lot.
That is a lot.
That's a lot of relatives, yeah. And
what did your mother do for Zia?
I think Mother probably did some secretarial clerical work because she wasn't, she didn't have really a career, if you will. She always stayed home and was a housewife, what they used to say. And but she did work for just a short time up there. So, and I think that was when we lived on the Manhattan Loop, because I know my sister was like 4 maybe, and I hated it because I had to babysit during the summer while she worked. So I hated babysitting with this little sister of mine. So, but I don't know what she did or where she worked or if she was in the tech area or what. I just don't remember that. We had no hospitals. Getting back to our health, everything, when we got sick, and here again, you paid no money. When we got sick, you just went to the military bay area there where they had their little hospital, and they would give us whatever it was we needed for our illness. Took very good care of us. And then they did build, of course, they built a beautiful big hospital up there, later on. But at the time, it's just the way it was. We were we had all the advantages because they had great doctors in the military. And the hospitals were great. I know I had strep throat, and I had to go to the hospital with strep throat. And I had to make up my own bed. You had to take the sheets off and you had to make up your own because that's what the military does, even as a little kid. But it was great. It was fine. It was different. We were very well taken care of.
So how did growing up at Los Alamos affect your later life?
Well, I think that you can't put my upbringing and put it and compare it with someone else's childhood. Even my own children, who had to be closely watched, and my grandchildren that have to be closely guarded. I mean, it was so different that I think one thing that it has given me a good education in all areas, all aspects of my life, and a very open mind. Because some of my best friends, they weren't physicists and they weren't scientists. They might have a lesser position, but we were all together in a community that was very, very small, and we relied and we depended on each other for social reasons. So we didn't know what each other did. We know that not everyone was a physicist like Jimmy Bradbury's father, but it didn't make any difference. There were no social lines drawn. There were a lot of Mexicans that I went to school with, a lot of different ethnic kinds of individual. It made no difference. And I think that because of that kind of approach, when a kid is growing up during those years, everyone is the same. Everyone is basically the same. There was no social barriers, none whatsoever. And it's just the way it was. And so when you grow up with that, you said, how does it affect my life today? I think that had a tremendous effect on me. Because growing up, let's say, in other schools around the country during those days, you could become a little one way or the other, set in your ways, if you will. And we didn't have that. We were free. We had each other, regardless of how old you were or what your background was. It made no difference. So that's an interesting question. I've never been asked that before. And I think that in itself is why I hope that I have an open mind about human beings and who they are and where they came from. So that's an interesting question. Thank you.
Did you have a lot of Hispanic friends in the community?
Oh, tons. Oh, my goodness. The Martinez family lived right next door, Mr. and Mrs. Martinez. And Secondino Sandoval helped me get through geometry, for crying out loud. I was terrible in math, horrible. And so he, would you help me with this or would you help me with that? And like I said, they were wonderful. Terrible, terrible math. Oh, awful. And so yes, all of my area where we lived, the majority of these people were Hispanics. And unfortunately, now my father grew up in Texas with Hispanics. That's why my name is Dolores, Dolores. It's the Spanish Dolores. It's not D-E, it's D-O. And that's why I'm named Dolores, because my father grew up with Hispanic people and speaks Spanish. And I'm so sorry that my friends didn't speak Spanish to me growing up in that area so that I could pick up at least converse socially in Spanish. But when they would leave their house and speaking nothing but Spanish, they would revert to English. So they were bilingual, and we weren't. I mean, we just spoke English with a few little words here and there that we were taught, which I can't repeat, in Spanish. But no, all of my neighbors on all sides, and especially the ones right next door, the Martinezes. And that was Gilbert Martinez, Jimmy Martinez, all those kids Jimmy was the closest one to me. Gilbert was older, and they had a lot of kids. But they were great. They were absolutely awesome. Loved them dearly.
Well, this has been really great. Do you have any other funny or interesting stories you'd like to share?
I think that I've just about covered as much as I can remember. Probably when it's all said and done and I'm going to go in the other room and go, why didn't I think of that? But I don't think so. I think that I've given you kind of a little feel, kind of a, I hope so. I hope that I gave, my definitions were good, and I hope that I relayed some of the feelings and some of the ways that we as children saw Los Alamos. We had no responsibilities. We had no work. We didn't have to work. Well, we didn't need any money. Later on, they started charging a little bit to go to the movies or something, and I would babysit. But other than that, everything that we got was free. So we didn't need to have money. So we didn't need to work as children. So I hope that I have gotten over the flavor, the way it was when we were living there. That was my one desire, to do that today, and I hope that I have done it.
You absolutely have. Just one more question I just thought of. Did you find Los Alamos and the nature around it really beautiful?
It was one of the most beautiful settings I think that I've ever seen in my life. And there's a setting I really want to be very, very, I need to share this. One night it had snowed all day, and we were walking across a large portion of land. It had nothing on it. And the snow had frozen. And we could stand there, my friends and I, and look back over this snow, and it was like an illusion. And it had to be coming from the stars on this ice that looked greenish and yellowish hues on this ice. And I didn't know, we thought it was a miracle, and I didn't really understand what that was until I went to Alaska. And we went on top, we walked on glaciers. The glaciers had the same kind of a green hue that we saw that very special night. And it was because of the rays, the sun rays coming down through the ice with the water, and it puts off these kinds of beautiful colors. So as far as the view, as far as the wilderness and the mountains, we were covered by mountains on all sides. North, south, east, west were nothing but huge, huge mountains. And they were absolutely incredible, absolutely incredible. Like I said, I have to go back there periodically and get my mountain fix, because it gets into your system, into your little brain. There's nothing to take the place of those gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous mountains.